The first thing I, Vorrak-Sehn, third-rank observer of the Galactic Passenger Authority, learned about humans was that they are annoyingly small. The second thing I learned was that annoyingly small does not mean annoyingly weak. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because my superior, High Commander Bleth, demanded a full written report of what happened at Gate 7 Delta on the 14th rotation of the Terran processing corridor, he said, and I quote with great personal embarrassment, "I want every single detail, Vorrak-Sehn, every single one, because what I watched on the security feed was the most confusing 12 seconds of footage this station has recorded in 40 years of operation. So here it is, my full report, my complete, total, deeply humiliating, full report. It started the way everything on this station starts, with paperwork, with delays, and with the low grinding noise of approximately 400 beings standing in a queue that moved at the speed of continental drift. Gate 7 Delta is not, by any measurement, the most glamorous assignment in the Galactic Passenger Authority. It is the processing corridor for newly registered species, which means it is the corridor where you get the confused ones, the loud ones, the ones who have never seen a biometric scanner and decide right there in front of everyone that they would like to argue with it philosophically. Humans had been given full transit rights 8 months prior, after the famous Accord of Salura Prime. They were still new, still figuring out how interstellar travel worked, still doing things like bringing entire cooked meals through security in containers, so enormous that my colleague Drovaki had to use both of his upper arms and one of his lower auxiliary limbs just to lift one of them onto the scanner belt. "What is inside this?" Drovaki had asked the human, blinking all 4 of his eyes in polite confusion. "Lasagna," the human said, as if that answered anything at all. It did not answer anything at all, but I digress. That is not the incident. The incident involves a different human entirely. A human named, and I am reading directly from her transit papers here, Mira Okafor-Banks. Mira Okafor-Banks. 5 feet 4 inches by human measurement, what their species calls early 30s, short hair, cut close to her head, eyes so dark they looked almost black under the station lighting. She was wearing what I would later learn humans refer to as business casual, which apparently means clothing that says I am professional while also saying I am ready to run if I need to. She was standing in the priority processing lane, third in line, holding a small rectangular bag over one shoulder, and reading something on a flat electronic device with the focused intensity of someone who had exactly zero interest in the world around them. She looked, to be perfectly honest, like the least threatening being in the entire corridor. I want you to remember I said that. The incident began with Gurrath. Gurrath is not, and I say this with the full professional objectivity of a third-rank observer, a good person. Gurrath is a Velhari male, which means he stands approximately 7 feet tall, has a bony ridge running from the back of his skull to the middle of his spine, and possesses the particular combination of physical size and self-importance that the universe, in its infinite cruelty, occasionally packages together in one being. Gurrath was a cargo broker. He traveled the processing corridors regularly. He knew the rules. He knew the procedures. He knew specifically that the priority processing lane requires a Class 4 transit medallion, and that attempting to enter it without one results in a fine, a delay, and a very strongly worded notice from the authority. Gurrath did not have a Class 4 transit medallion. Gurrath had instead something he apparently considered far more valuable: confidence. He walked directly past the queue, past the signage, past my colleague Drovaki, who made the mistake of being distracted by his third encounter with the lasagna situation, and he stepped right into the priority processing lane, right behind Mira Okafor-Banks, and he stood there with the relaxed posture of someone who believed, on a fundamental level, that rules were written for other people. I was at my station, approximately 15 feet away, handling the documentation review for a Sulhari diplomat who had lost one of her 3 passports and was trying to describe which pocket she thought she had put it in. My attention was divided. This is important context. This is not an excuse. I am simply providing context. The priority lane moved. The diplomat ahead of Mira finished processing. Mira stepped forward to the scanner. And Gurrath, who had apparently decided that waiting even those additional 11 seconds was beneath him, put one very large hand on Mira's shoulder and pushed her, physically, and without any ambiguity whatsoever, out of the way. Not hard enough to knock her over, but hard enough that she stumbled one full step to the side, hard enough that the bag slipped off her shoulder, hard enough that her electronic reading device clattered to the floor, hard enough that she looked up from where she had stumbled, and looked at him. Now I have processed beings from 63 registered species through this corridor. I have seen Drovaki merchants in the middle of trade disputes. I have seen Haranali soldiers with active grievances. I have seen a Sulhari matriarch told that her emotional support creature, which was approximately the size of a small vehicle, did not qualify for cabin seating. I have never seen a look quite like the one Mira Okafor-Banks gave Gurrath in that moment. It was not a look of fear. It was not even a look of immediate anger. Exactly, it was something quieter than anger, something that had passed through anger so quickly that it was already on the other side of it. It was a look that said, very calmly, very clearly, "Oh, you made a mistake." Gurrath, because Gurrath is Gurrath, did not notice. "Move," he said, in the Volhari dialect, which I will translate for this report as, "move," because the translation is literal. He just said move, no honorific, no apology, not even the acknowledgement that she was a being capable of receiving an apology. Mira picked up her bag. She picked up her electronic device. She checked the screen briefly to confirm it had not cracked. Then she straightened up, turned to face him fully, and in perfectly flat, absolutely fluent galactic standard, she said, "No, just that, just the one word," delivered with the warm emotional temperature of a closed door. Gurrath blinked. Both of his secondary eyes twitched, which on a Velhari is the equivalent of a double take. He was not, clearly, accustomed to the word no, especially not delivered by something less than 2/3 his height. He leaned forward, and I watched him make the decision. I watched him decide that this small human, standing alone in a corridor full of strangers, with no visible backup, no obvious authority, and no apparent weapons, was someone he could simply ignore. He reached out, took hold of her upper arm, and attempted to physically move her out of the scanner position. I want to pause here, and note that in my official report, I have marked the next 12 seconds as incident duration. My superior, High Commander Bleth, after watching the security footage, told me that 12 seconds was the most eventful 12 seconds he had ever timed. He was not wrong. What happened next I will describe as accurately as I can, given that my brain, which is designed to process information at a rate sufficient for most situations, had some difficulty keeping up. Mira did not yell. She did not step back. She did not look around for help. She moved. I have since consulted with the Authority species database regarding human physical capabilities, and I want to share some findings that I feel are criminally underrepresented in the standard onboarding literature we give to new human travelers. Humans are, relative to their body mass, disproportionately strong. This is a consequence of their evolutionary history, which apparently involved an extended period of time on a planet where nearly everything was trying to eat them, and they survived not by being the fastest or the largest, but by being stubborn, adaptable, and capable of storing and releasing physical force in ways that larger species do not always anticipate. Furthermore, and this is the part that I believe is most relevant to the incident, humans have developed, over thousands of years, a collection of fighting systems specifically designed to allow smaller individuals to neutralize larger ones. Mira Okafor-Banks, as I would learn approximately 4 hours later when I was filling out the incident paperwork and she was very calmly drinking something from a cup and answering my questions, had been practicing one of these systems since she was 9 years old. 23 years. She had been doing this for 23 years. I did not know that when I watched her move, I only knew what I saw, which was Gurrath's hand closed around her arm, and then in a sequence of movements so fast and so certain that it looked almost choreographed, she did something with her wrist, something with her shoulder, something with her entire body weight that I still cannot fully describe in terms my species language has vocabulary for. And suddenly Gurrath's arm was behind his back at an angle it was not supposed to be at, and Gurrath's face was against the processing counter, and Gurrath was making a sound that Velhari males make when something has gone extremely specifically wrong. The whole corridor went quiet. Not the polite, gradual quiet of people noticing something. The instant total quiet of 400 beings all having the same thought at exactly the same time, which was, what just happened? Mira held him there, not struggling, not adjusting, just holding him with the patient, unhurried stillness of someone who had done this before and was in no particular rush. I said no, she said, still in Galactic Standard, still in that same flat, closed-door tone. The lane is first come, first served. You will wait your turn. When I move you can step up, not before. Gurrath said something in Velhari that I will not translate in this official report. I don't speak that dialect, Mira said, which was, given her earlier perfectly fluent Galactic standard, almost certainly a choice rather than a fact. But if you're asking whether I'll let go, the answer is yes. Once you confirm you understand. There was a pause. The pause lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which Gurrath, who was 7 feet tall and outweighed Mira by what I estimate was 160 pounds, was held motionless against a processing counter by a human woman who had not raised her voice once. I understand, Gurrath said. Mira let go. She stepped back to the scanner. She placed her palm on the plate. The green light confirmed her identity. She picked up her bag, tucked her reading device under her arm, and walked through the processing gate without looking back. Gurrath stood up slowly. He rotated his arm with the careful testing motion of someone confirming that the joint still worked the way it was supposed to. Then he stepped to the back of the queue. Not the priority lane, the regular queue. He did not argue about this. The silence in the corridor held for approximately 3 more seconds after Mira disappeared through the gate. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the general queue, someone began to applaud. I do not know which species started it. By the time I identified the source, it had spread. Sulhari, Drovaki, 2 Velhari, who were decidedly not Gurrath, a family group of Harenali, who I am fairly certain had no idea what had just happened, but were enjoying the energy, all of them clapping, or doing the equivalent of clapping for their particular biology. I stood at my station, and I watched this and I thought several things in rapid succession. First, I should have intervened earlier. Second, I am not entirely sure how I would have intervened. Third, the Galactic Passenger Authority's training manual does not have a section for this. Dret appeared at my shoulder. He had finally resolved the lasagna situation. He stood next to me and watched Gurrath standing very quietly in the general queue with the expression of a being who had recently reconsidered some of his life choices. Did she break it? Dret asked. I do not think so, I said. She would have needed to apply approximately 40% more pressure to fracture the primary joint on a Velhari of that build. Dret was quiet for a moment. So she knew exactly how much pressure to use. I thought about that. Yes, I said. I believe she did. We stood there together in the quiet aftermath of Gate 7 Delta, in the slow return to the ordinary noise of a processing corridor, with 400 beings going back to their queues and their documentation and their enormous containers of lasagna. And I thought about the human, about those 23 years, about the look she had given Gurrath before any of it happened, about how she had picked up her bag and her reading device and checked the screen before she did anything else, like she already knew how it was going to end, like she had always known. I filed the initial incident report at 14:32 station time. I marked Gurrath for a formal complaint and a 2-cycle travel restriction. I noted Mira Okafor-Banks as a witness, and then in the section labeled Additional Observations I wrote the following. Human travelers should be assessed for prior combat training during intake processing. Current documentation does not adequately reflect species-level physical capabilities. Recommend update to standard briefing materials. High Commander Bleth read my report the next morning. He called me into his office. He sat behind his desk with the security footage pulled up on his screen. Paused on the moment just before Mira moved. Vorrak-Sehn, he said. Sir, this is the 3rd incident involving human travelers this quarter. I waited. The first one, he said, pulling up another file, involved a human male named Jesper Oladay, who talked to Drovaki weapons merchant out of a confrontation using only conversation and what witnesses described as, and I am reading this directly, unreasonable friendliness. Yes, sir, I remember that one. The second, he continued, involved a human female named Tova Burke, who when a Sulhari dignitary's luggage cart rolled toward a group of children from the Harenali delegation, picked up the cart, the full cart, by herself, and moved it. The cart weighed 400 standard units, I confirmed. She confirmed this afterward and seemed mildly annoyed by the attention. Bleth leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the expression of a being who was revising something he thought he understood. What? He said slowly. Are we dealing with? I thought about Mira Okafor-Banks, about the look she gave Gurrath before the 12 seconds, about the silence of the corridor after, about 400 beings from 63 species, all applauding. I think, I said carefully, we are dealing with something that the registration documents describe as a medium-sized primate from a single inhabited planet in the outer systems. Bleth waited. And I think, I continued, that the registration documents are going to need some significant revisions. Bleth looked at the paused footage for a long moment. "Get me a full species assessment," he said finally. "I want behavioral range, physical capability benchmarks, social structure, conflict response patterns, everything." "Yes, sir." "And Vorrak-Sehn?" "Sir?" He looked at the frozen image of Mira Okafor-Banks, standing at the scanner, bag over her shoulder, device in hand, walking through the gate like nothing had happened at all. "Find out if they're all like that." I went back to my station. I pulled up the human species file. I began to read, and the more I read, the more I understood that High Commander Bleth's question, "Find out if they're all like that," was possibly the most important question the Galactic Passenger Authority had ever asked. Because the answer, as far as I could tell, was, not exactly, but close enough. Close enough that the next time a Gurrath decided that small meant safe, the station was going to need a much bigger incident report form. The human species file is, and I say this as someone who has now read it 3 times cover to cover, a masterpiece of understatement. It begins, as all authority species files begin, with a physical overview: average height, average mass, bilateral symmetry, standard oxygen breathing biometrics, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, the usual arrangement. It lists their planet, which is called Earth, a name so simple that the first time I saw it in print I assumed it was a translation error. It lists their atmospheric requirements, their dietary classifications, their temperature tolerances, and then buried on page 11, in a section titled Notable Physical Characteristics, it says the following, and again I am reading directly from the document: "Humans possess an unusually high pain tolerance relative to comparable species. They are capable of continuing physical activity under conditions of injury that would incapacitate most registered travelers. This is believed to be an adaptation related to their evolutionary history." Page 11. That information is on page 11, after the section about their preferred sleeping temperatures. I flagged this to High Commander Bleth in a supplementary note. He responded with a single line: "I see it, keep reading." I kept reading. Page 17. Humans have a documented capacity for what xenopsychologists classify as protective aggression, wherein threat to a third party, particularly a smaller or more vulnerable individual, triggers a measurably heightened physical response beyond standard defensive capability. Page 22. Social bonding among humans occurs rapidly and with notable durability. Humans who have formed a social bond, even briefly, have been documented taking significant personal risk on behalf of the bonded individual. Page 31. Human emotional states do not always correlate with visible physical signals in ways that align with standard cross-species assessment models. A human who appears calm may be under significant internal stress. A human who appears to be smiling may be experiencing emotions that, in other species, would be expressed through aggressive signaling. I stopped on page 31, and I sat with that for a while. I thought about Mira Okafor-Banks, about the look on her face before she moved, about how calm she was, about how she checked the screen on her device before she did anything else, about how, the entire time, including the 12 seconds, she had not stopped looking calm. I kept reading. The second incident happened on the 41st rotation after the first one, which means I had been studying the human species file for 41 days and still was not ready for it. The station had been busier than usual. A diplomatic exchange convoy from the Drovaki hegemony had arrived 2 days ahead of schedule, which threw the entire processing rotation sideways and resulted in a corridor situation that my supervisor described as a controlled failure, which is authority language for everything is on fire, but we have decided to call it management. I was assigned to the overflow handling in Corridor 9, which connects Gate 7 Delta to the main transit hub. It is a long corridor, institutional lighting, benches along one side, a row of service dispensers that have been broken for at least 2 years and which maintenance continues to list as pending review. The human family group arrived at approximately the 9th hour of my shift. There were 4 of them, a man and a woman, and 2 children. The man's name, per the transit documents I would review later, was Dayo Femi-Carr. The woman was called Suki Femi-Carr. The children were listed as Ren, age 7, and Pip, age 4. Pipe, 4 years old, wearing a small orange garment with what I would later learn is a stitched image of a Terran animal called a frog, and carrying a stuffed replica of the same animal under one arm, and looking around the corridor with the enormous, unguarded curiosity of a being who has not yet learned that the universe is occasionally dangerous. They were waiting. The convoy delay had backed everything up and there was nothing to do but sit on the benches and wait, which the adults were doing with the patient exhaustion of people who had been traveling for a long time, and which the children were doing by periodically climbing on things. I noticed them because Pip wandered slightly too far from the bench, as 4-year-olds do, and I had to gently redirect her back toward her parents. Her mother, Suki, thanked me in Galactic Standard with an accent so perfect I briefly wondered if she had studied linguistics. Her father, Dayo, was asleep sitting upright with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to sleep anywhere. They were entirely ordinary. They were exactly what you expect when you process family travelers. Tired, patient, and held together by the particular energy of parents who are running on a combination of willpower and the knowledge that the children are watching. I moved on to the rest of the corridor. I should have stayed. The Drovaki group that entered Corridor 9 20 minutes later was not part of the diplomatic convoy. They were private travelers, 3 of them, registered cargo associates traveling under a transit permit that I would later discover had been flagged twice for irregularities that no one had followed up on because of the convoy chaos. Drovaki are large, not as large as Valhari, but broad, heavily built, with a dense physical presence that takes up more space than their actual dimensions suggest. These 3 had the specific energy of beings who were frustrated about the delay, had been drinking something, and had decided that Corridor 9 was a place where the normal rules of public behavior did not apply. Their names were Czech, foreign, and the one who started it, whose name was Dull. I want to note for the record that Dull is a perfectly ordinary Drovaki name with no particular translation implication. I only mention it because it felt in retrospect deeply appropriate. Dull noticed the human family. Specifically, Dull noticed Ren, the 7-year-old, who had climbed to the top of a bench and was attempting to see if he could touch the ceiling, because he was 7, and that is what 7-year-olds do. Dull thought this was funny. He said something to Foreign and Czech in Drovaki dialect. They laughed, and then, because Dull was dull, he decided that funny was not enough, and that funny plus mean would be better. He walked over to the bench where Ren was standing, and he knocked it, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough that Ren lost his balance, stumbled, and sat down hard on the bench with the startled, wide-eyed expression of a child who does not understand what just happened, but knows it was not an accident. Ren did not cry. He looked at Dull with confused, wide eyes. Dull laughed again. And then, from approximately 15 feet away, where she had been sitting with Pip half asleep in her lap, Suki Femi-Carr stood up. Now, I had been reviewing the human species file for 41 days. I had read page 31 twice. I had read the section on protective aggression on page 17 3 times. I had in fact highlighted it. I was still not ready, because the file describes protective aggression as a heightened physical response. That is the language it uses. Heightened, physical, response. What I watched Suki Femi-Carr do in the next 40 seconds was not what I would describe as a heightened physical response. What I would describe it as, if I were writing the species file myself, is this. When a human perceives a threat to their offspring, a biological process occurs which temporarily reclassifies them as a different kind of being entirely. Suki handed Pip to a startled Salhari traveler seated nearby. She did not ask permission. She made eye contact, transferred the child, and the Salhari, to their credit, caught Pip automatically and held her with the instinctive carefulness of someone who understood that they had just been assigned an important responsibility. Then Suki walked toward Dull. She was not running. She was not yelling. She was walking with the specific, measured pace of someone who has decided something and is now simply executing that decision. Her face was the same quiet, total calm I had seen on Mira Okafor-Banks 41 days earlier, and I felt in the back of my mind a section of the species file begin to glow with sudden new meaning. Dull saw her coming. He was twice her width and several inches taller. He had 2 companions. He was by every physical measurement the larger party in this situation. He said something dismissive in Drovaki dialect. Suki stopped 2 feet from him. "You touched my son," she said, in Galactic Standard, very quietly. Dull looked at her with the expression of someone who found this genuinely amusing, and then she hit him. I want to be precise here, because I will be asked to be precise in the formal report. She struck him once, open palm, on the side of the face, with a force that snapped his head sideways and produced a sound in the corridor that made every single being in that space go completely still. Dull stumbled 2 full steps sideways. Foreign and Czech moved forward, and this is the part that I replay in my memory the most, because it is the part that the species file had told me about and that I still did not fully believe until I saw it with my own eyes. Dayo Femi-Carr woke up. Not gradually, not with the slow blinking confusion of someone pulled from sleep by noise. He went from sitting upright and completely asleep to standing and moving in a single motion so fluid that it seemed physically impossible, as if the sleep had been a switch that someone flipped off. He crossed the corridor in 4 steps. He put himself between Suki and the 2 advancing Drovaki, and he looked at them, and I watched Forin and Czech stop moving. Not because Dayo was larger than them. He was not. Not because he was armed. He was not. Not because he made any threatening sound or gesture. They stopped because of his face. I have been trying to find the right words for this since it happened, and I am still not certain I have them. It was not an angry face, exactly. It was a face that had gone somewhere past anger, to a place that was very quiet and very focused, and somehow, in that quietness, more alarming than any display of rage would have been. It was the face of a being who was not calculating whether to act, who had already acted inside, and was simply waiting for the external situation to catch up. Page 31 of the species file. I heard it in my head like a bell. A human who appears calm may be experiencing emotions that, in other species, would be expressed through aggressive signaling. Vorrak-Sehn said something to Czech in Drovaki dialect. Czech said something back. They both looked at Dayo. They looked at Suki, who had not moved and was still watching Dull with the same expression she had crossed the corridor with. Dull was holding his face with one hand. He was looking at Suki with an expression I recognized across species lines. It was the expression of a being who had made an error in threat assessment and was now quietly and without anyone watching them do it, revising their entire model of the world. Forin and Czech took a step back. I finally moved. I crossed the corridor in what I can only describe as a controlled jog that was nearly but not quite a run, because authority personnel do not run in passenger corridors, and I got between the groups and I held up my identification badge and I said, in my loudest and most official voice, Galactic Passenger Authority. Everyone stop. Everyone had already stopped. I was, in terms of timing, about 30 seconds too late to matter. The processing took 2 hours. Dull required a brief medical assessment. He was fine. He was very quiet during the assessment. He answered questions in monosyllables and did not make eye contact with anyone. Forin and Czech were cited for aggressive advancement in a public corridor. They accepted the citation without argument, which my colleague Dret, who assisted with the paperwork, noted was unusually cooperative for a Drovaki travel infraction. They kept looking at the door, Dret told me afterward, in the small processing office where we were filing everything. The whole time, like they wanted to confirm it was still there. I understood why. Suki Femi-Carr sat in the processing office with Pip back in her lap, awake now and investigating the fringe on her mother's sleeve with intense 4-year-old focus. Suki answered every question clearly and without agitation. She apologized for the physical contact with Dull, which she described as a reaction, in a tone of voice that suggested she did not consider it a particularly interesting reaction, and was mostly apologizing because she understood the procedural requirement. Dayo sat next to her with Ren under one arm, and Ren had fallen asleep against his father's side, which I found, given what I had just watched this man do from a standing start, deeply disorienting in the best possible way. I asked the questions I was required to ask, and then at the end, when the official part was done, I asked the question that had been in my mind for 41 days. In your species database file, I said carefully, there is a section on what is called protective aggression. I have read it several times. I thought I understood it. Suki looked at me with a calm, polite attention. Do you, I asked, and I was not sure how to phrase this, do you all experience it that way? The way you did today? She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at Pip, who had fallen asleep against her. She looked at Ren, asleep against Dayo. Something moved through her face that I did not have a species file entry for. When it's your kids, she said finally, you don't really think about it. I wrote that down. I do not know exactly why. It did not fit neatly into any official report section. Dayo, who had been quiet through most of the processing, looked at me from across the table with those eyes that had stopped 2 Drovaki males without a single word. We appreciate you asking, he said. Most people don't ask. They just watch and then walk away looking confused. I have been confused, I admitted, for 41 days. He smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and uncomplicated, and it was so completely at odds with the face I had watched him show in the corridor that for a moment I genuinely questioned whether they were the same being. We're pretty normal, he said. Mostly. Mostly, Suki confirmed, and the two of them exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation I was not part of. I submitted my full species assessment to High Commander Bleth the following morning. 47 pages. Physical capability benchmarks, behavioral range documentation, conflict response patterns with specific attention to the protective aggression section, which I had expanded from half a page to 11 pages, with annotated incident examples. I also submitted a recommended revision to the standard intake briefing materials for Gate 7 Delta. The revision was 7 points. I will share the most important one here, because I believe it captures everything. Point 4. Human travelers who appear calm should not be assessed as passive. In this species, the absence of visible agitation does not indicate the absence of readiness. This distinction is critical for accurate threat and behavior assessment in corridor situations. Bleth read the full report. He called me in. He sat behind his desk with the report in his hands, and he was quiet for a long time. Vorrak-Sehn, he said finally. Sir, in 40 years of running this station, he said, I have processed beings from over 60 species. I have seen things that I did not believe were possible until I saw them. He set the report down. He looked at me. Why, he said, did we not know any of this before we gave them transit rights? I thought about that. I thought about the species file, page 11, buried after the sleeping temperature section. I thought about Mira Okafor-Banks walking through the gate without looking back. I thought about Suki Femi-Carr handing Pip to a stranger with perfect confidence and crossing a corridor to make a point. I thought about Dayo's face. I think, I said slowly, that they knew, and they were waiting to see if we would figure it out on our own. Bleth stared at me. That, he said, is either a very reassuring answer or a very alarming one. Yes, sir, I said. I think that is the correct response to most things about humans. He looked at my report for another long moment. Approved, he said. All 7 points, update the briefing materials, and Vorrak-Sehn? Sir. Next intake of human travelers, he said. I want you personally on the floor. I nodded. I picked up my report. I walked back to my station in Corridor 9, past the benches where a small orange frog garment had been left behind, and which I had already set aside in the lost items collection with a careful note attached, and I looked down the long, ordinary length of the corridor with its institutional lighting and its broken service dispensers, and its slowly moving queues of beings from 63 registered species, and somewhere, out there, past the gates and the processing lanes and the transit hub that connected this small station to the enormous branching network of everywhere else, 2 human children were sleeping on their father's side, while their mother read on her device, and the universe carried them forward into whatever came next. Very normal, mostly. I opened a new file on my station terminal. I labeled it Human Travelers Ongoing Assessment, Rotation 42 and Beyond. I typed the first line. They are small, they are calm, and they have been doing this for longer than we have been watching them. Then I saved it, leaned back in my chair, and waited for the next cue to begin,